The next subject will be what was agreed about this. So I would like to invite some people to join me here. People who were leading this project and can tell us about it, and who are working in this complex world on a daily basis, as was mentioned by Toomas Estermann. So I would like to invite here Head of Finance of University of Tartu, Kalle Hein, and Head of Research Administration of the Tallinna University of Technology, Aivar Auväärt. Please come up here. Until these gentlemen are seated and get their mics, I would like to ask the rest of you. We are speaking about the different systems, different parties to research funding. But let's see who's present here today. Please put up your hand when I'm asking you who are the people who are researchers using project-based funding or has done it before. Thank you. Who of you are representing funders or funding organizations? Thank you. Who is representing companies that have been cooperating with the university within the framework of a project? And who are the representatives of the universities? Thanks a lot. So this was just an overview of the audience present today. Before we get down to business, speaking about the specific method, when you were listening to the presentations in the morning half of the day, could you tell us what thoughts came to you listening to these presentations? Maybe you had already heard about those examples before, and Toomas Estermann on several times mentioned methods that universities had agreed about in other countries as well. Maybe you could comment briefly on this. What thoughts came to you? Good afternoon. What thoughts came to me? Every time when I listen to these pan-European presentations, then I realize that European countries are really different and the universities are very different in Europe. And there is no magic wand really that you can use. That's the main principle. That's what I always notice. Good afternoon. For me, a very important statement was trust. The same trust by the funders, by the auditors. This is really the foundation. This is from where we should start. If trust exists, then we can move on. I asked on purpose who were present today among this audience. We probably will have to look at the research funding system and how the different parties view the system. I should have asked also if there are people who represent public interest as well, because communication with the general public is becoming ever more important. But let's now look at the specific method from the point of view of the different parties involved. Yeah, as you can see from this slide, there are different views of the university, the funder and the researcher. Typically, the university tries to make sure that its finances are sustainable so that all activities of the university can be undertaken and that some money might be left over by the end of the year as well. The funder, on its turn, wants to have the goals set achieved by using minimal resources. And the researcher is just interested in doing what his or her goal has been by come what may, rather, we should say. But this may not be the proper way to say it, but the researcher is not really interested in the money, apart from the fact that it has to exist. But are there other points of tension what you should try to avoid? Yeah, well, there are tensions, definitely, because the university has the obligation to maintain its researchers, provide the premises. The funder obviously thinks always that the costs have not been used effectively or efficiently. Maybe even the costs have not been used for the right purpose. There could be conflicts from that. And the researcher, I always place the researcher on the highest place here, because you have to trust the researcher, because he knows what he does. I thought about a question before, and maybe I could ask this right now. When we are speaking about funding science and scientific projects, so what does effectiveness mean, especially given what Rector Aaviksoo said at the beginning? Because once the researchers start out, they do not really know where they end up with. Well, in research, a negative result is always a positive result as well. So we have to agree about this, that this may be the result as well at the very beginning, so that both sides understand this in the same way. Because it's very often so that the funder does not really understand properly what the final result could be of the work. When we look at the method now, anyone who has written project applications and project reports know that there are eligible costs and non-eligible costs. And Joan Hines also mentioned this in one of her responses. So, what is your opinion of this? Because today, not all costs related to projects are eligible costs. Or should they be? How is it? Well, this is precisely so. When we look at the project cycle that you can see also on the slide, then projects are initiated first, applications are written, additions are added, at one point they are submitted. When you're lucky, you get the money. And once the project is ended, then there is a report and the general public is informed about the results. And in between there is the project life. But not all costs are eligible even then. And the success rate of applications is very modest. You can get a positive result per every 10 applications, really. And this is not a reasonable way of spending time by researchers. And also you could see that the baseline financing part in universities is roughly 18%. Some universities a little bit more, some a little bit less. But this shows that this is like the free money. All the rest of the money has been achieved by writing these 10 applications. Project applications. So this is not reasonable. So why the universities started working on this, how to develop indirect costs and how to figure out this new method? Because we had a hypothesis that the existing indirect cost rates that very few of the funders were actually considering eligible 5 years ago, and this was not sustainable for the universities. That is why you started to work on these methods. Later we will add numbers that we figured out and what has happened by today with these numbers. But in more general terms, before we go into detail, so is the message that the project-based funding should cover those costs that are related to preparation and the follow-up activities, or rather the baseline financing should be so much higher that those parts of the costs that are not covered by the project money should come from the baseline? Well, the answer is that there should be a combination. For the first and the last phase, we should have an increase in the baseline funding, and then for the main part of the project, the money should come from the project funding. But let's look now at the methods that the universities in cooperation have developed. So what does this mean in more precise terms? Well, the full costing is a method that has been tried out in several places, and the fact that we started this in Estonia, we have to thank for this Professor Jaak Aaviksoo, TalTech rector, who back then was rector of the University of Tartu. And he put pressure on us to start dealing with this and working this out. And the main thing is, whether we are a university or a private company, it is important for us to know what activity costs, so that we can make strategic decisions about our activities based on the costs, and we can move in the right direction. For example, when we look at the universities and we are speaking about curricula, for example, the cost of our curricula, in order for us to be able to pursue an activity in the university, and we've heard many times today that universities are very complex institutions, and it's very difficult to break down the share of the teaching activities and the research activities of our academic staff, and how to show this in our reporting system. That is why we have started using or developing this full costing method. And back in 2014, all Estonian universities, public law universities, came together, and we applied for some funding from structural funds, and over several years we carried out we entered into an agreement about full costing. The process was quite complicated because our universities turned out to be quite different as well. But finally we came to agreement. There is also a brochure that has this summary about our work. And what we wanted to achieve was to prove, that was during the 7th framework program period, where there was an option that if the state could prove the method of indirect costs calculations, then it was possible to have it accepted as well. We did not reach the full goal here, but we actually figured out at least the method, so that at the beginning of the new program period, we have it, and the European Commission has also simplified it so that you could use a 25% here, and we use the simplified method of 15% of the payroll costs. That means that previously we could compensate only indirect costs on the basis of documented costs. But if we get today 15%, this is quite a good result. And the full costing method is a method where all costs are assigned to cost objects. And in this way we get the total costs, then there's direct costs and indirect costs. And there's also overheads.
Overheadid, kui on kellegile parem mõiste selleks.
And all these costs are divided by certain cost drivers to cost objects. And the most important cost driver used elsewhere in Europe is working time.
kui me alustasime selle objektiga,
When we started with this project,
ehk töö või see tööaja tabel, milles siin ka täna
and
see teema pealkirjas on,
and the timesheets that are part of the subject today as well, then in the University of Tartu, we asked, so what is actually the right time? How do we figure out the real working time? Well, you go and ask them, you monitor, but we decided to go a different way. And we made an anonymous web survey, and we promised all academic staff that this was going to be anonymous. And it was a good thing that we promised this, because finally the heads of institutes wanted to get this information, but luckily we didn't give it to them. And that is why we could involve more institutes. So through 2 institutes in the University of Tartu, in the Chemical Institute and the Faculty of Economy, we mapped anonymously the working time. We took a statistical sample of staff of different levels, and during a certain period, at certain moments during the whole year, they, depending also on the intensity of the work, like the exam periods and regular working periods, and to the precision of 15 minutes, they logged their working time. And do you know what the result was? Here is an example of the Faculty of Economy, the timesheet, which academic staff have logged quite honestly, which means that all of you who are filling your worksheets, timesheets, you know that you have worked 40 hours a week. You could see that the assistants had said that they have worked 65.8 hours. And the most modest is the senior research fellow who only works 46.7 hours. So on the average, academic staff worked 1.4 times of their full-time equivalent. What is the view of the labor inspector when they look at this? This person should have 40% more salary because of overtime. How to include the overtime in your timesheets that you submit to the European Commission or elsewhere to the Estonian funders? So actually,
kasutada töötabelitel või töö kirjeldamiseks tegelikult protsentuaalset jaotust.
So it is, you can use a percentage-based division for your timesheets. So there are 40 hours a week, and percentage-wise you can share this working time between your different activities. Or when you look at Finland, where academic staff can sum up the different activities or the different hours spent on different activities on the basis of their immediate superiors. I also mentioned that this was the experiment with our economic faculty, but then we decided to try this also in our Chemical Institute of Chemistry, and the result was slightly better. Only 1.2 times working time was exceeded. The most stable workers, or closer to the 40 hours per week, was the senior research fellow. Why did the assistant and the lecturer work the most of overtime? Because they were also teaching over the weekends, because of the specific nature of teaching. So that explains it as well.
Kuna tegelikult sellise töötabeliga ei
Given
ole
that
võimalik mingisugust kuluarvestust teha,
such working timetables or timesheets do not allow us to make any calculations concerning costs. So we decided to use the working time, division of working time based on the people's tasks. This is one of the options. And the job descriptions provide this. So we've been using full costing for all activities based on that, starting from 2014 up to 2018. And based
Teaduskultuurarvestusega
on this
arvestame välja
full
nii
costing
teaduse kulud,
method, we
vajalikud, ütleme,
figure out
kaudse kulukomponendid,
also the indirect cost components so that
olemasolevate
it
kuludega
would make it possible for the University of Tartu to manage with the existing costs.
palju peaks hea olema tase. Ja samuti arvutame välja
And we also
kõikide
calculate
õppekavade maksumused,
the cost of all curricula.
olen Tartu Ülikoolis näiteks ütleme eelmaast olnud, mis on ligi 230 õppekava.
And we have about 230 different curricula in the University of Tartu. So we really use this method.
Samas oleme seda sama
And we
metoodikat
have been using and explaining this method to our funders. Some of them have agreed with this, some have not.
Ma kasutan ära selle võimaluse, et ülikooli finantsjuht on laval, et küsida.
Since we have the CFO on the stage, I would like to ask you that if we had this kind of a cooperation between the financer, as we heard based on the Irish experience earlier, then during the lunch break we also talked to Thomas Esterman, and we asked in how many EU countries they can see that they have moved towards this sort of process-based audit, not checking the cost documents, and he said that this is a minority still. So if in Estonia, between the finances, we had this kind of cooperation, would this make your job easier? If all your funders would work like this together and they would carry out the audit of your process? And you trust this process? Definitely. And I would like to say that if we have a university such as Tartu, where they have a huge budget, then these processes need to be verified, because otherwise you can't really manage. Taking into account the situation is not like this today, then this is the methodology which you're using at the moment. So what are the main problematic areas looking at the financing at the moment? So what are the aspects which stand out? Well, let us move forward. We can see it from here. We did the calculations for indirect costs. And the questions were here before, whether the project should cover all the indirect costs related to it. Then we can look at the situation where we are today. Now, if you look at the financing for which comes from 25% for direct costs. And I would also like to thank the Estonian Research Agency. They have the same principles. And the size or the funding is more or less the same for indirect costs of the overhead. And if you look at the structural funds, then 15% is not enough, but it's better than we had at the previous period. And actually, what is the most difficult is we can see from the other ministries, because there are many ministries and local governments whose contract includes a fixed percentage for indirect costs. For example, the Ministry of Environment, until August, it's in service contract, it's said that you can have a overhead up to 7%. So we explain this, we show the justifications, we show that this is higher, and perhaps the Ministry of Environment could review this. And as a result, Ministry of Environment applied structural fund rules for all the contracts, so 50% of the labor cost and full reporting. This is one of the examples. So if you show them the evidence, well, it's relative, I would say. Anything to add, Aivar? So what are the challenges for the financing methods today? The main problem really is that we have we have the figures here which are not exactly current at the moment, but for the project it's not that high, it's the average total. indirect expense. But when we introduced this project 5 years ago, then we had a new period coming up. And the officials from the Ministry of Finance who were there to introduce the project were able to acknowledge this, that these indirect costs are important, but they made their own life a lot easier. So they chose the simplest method because it was possible for them to use a higher rate for overhead, but that would have meant extra jobs or extra tasks for the Ministry of Finance. So I hope during the next period it is going to be reviewed. Now, if we were to summarize this conversation, how exactly we should move, in Estonia, so we would have more trust So we have more trust between the financiers and the universities when it comes to the audited processes, and maybe more confidence between the universities to unify the accounting systems, for example. So it'll be good if we can have a better functioning system. I think all the parties have to contribute. So taking into account what one of the parties is the research party, I can give you an example. So what is the price at which the scientist or researcher should sell himself or herself if they're offering consultation or there's a contract? Is it a cost of 1 hour of their work, or is it also the overhead or the fixed expenses? Because if they only sell the working hour, that's not quite so. Because in the direct cost, there should be other headings. So another example, the university, for example, you want to open a research lab which is self-sufficient. So I asked them, what does it mean? It means that we have the lab technicians and they earn their salary back. So this is exactly the same. But I said, well, the materials, what about the room? You have the equipment, what about depreciation? Oh, but this is what is paid by the university, was the answer. So if this is our understanding, then it's not quite right yet. All the parties have to understand how it works, and the same is also true for the financiers, because when it comes to quite small amounts, then the administrative cost of handling it, or our HR department or finance department, it doesn't matter how big the project is, the costs are still there for administrative side, and it would be good if these costs were also covered. I have two ideas. Because if you look at the public procurement rules for the research agencies, then it should be not quite the same as for everybody else, because this increases the indirect expenses and also is a problem for the research being carried out. And also, we should not finance top-level research from structural funds, but it should come from the state budget. Thank you very much that you are ready to introduce your methodology. And a good example on how you can cooperate between the universities and to produce something which you can introduce to the finances as well. And this is a good basis to show them what exactly it is, what they're financing, and what it is, what is still missing. So thank you both.
Kõikidele väikesed sellised meened ka. Aitäh. Ja aitäh. Nii, aga meie teise seminari päeva poole selline suurem arutelu leiab siis aset nüüd järgnevas paneelis, kuhu mõnes mõttes kõik need küsimused ja mõtted, mida me oleme siin enne tõstatanud ja mida meiega on jagatud, jooksevad siis nüüd siia kokku ja
So all these topics will be covered by this session, and hopefully we can come to some good conclusion. So we will talk about the future in Estonia, what is possible to do. And for this panel discussion, we have here
süsteemi huvipoolte esindajaid siin
different
ja ma
interested
kutsuksin
parties
4
presented.
inimest siia
And I would
arutlema,
like to
aga
invite
selles
the four
arutelus
people
kõik
for the
ülejäänud on
discussion.
ka terve selle arutelu jooksul väga
You're all
oodatud
welcome to
kaasa
comment
mõtlema ja
and
kaasa
to
rääkima. Aga siia ma
ask
palun
questions. But I would
Toidu ja
like to invite on
Fermentatsioonitehnoloogia
this
Arenduskeskuse nõukogu esimehe Aavo
stage
Sõrmuse,
first of all Aavo Sõrmus from the
siis Eesti
Center for Food and
Teadusagentuuri
Fermentation
juhatuse
Technology
esimehe Andres
Center,
Koppeli,
Andres Koppel, who is
Rahandusministeeriumi
the External Research Council,
finantskontrolli osakonna juhataja
then
Kaur
Kaur
Siruli
Siruli from
ja
the
Tallinna
Ministry of
Ülikooli
Finance,
finantsjuhi Kurmet
Financial
Ojamaa.
Control
Olge
Department, and
head,
Kurmet Ojamaa, who is the CFO of the University of Tallinn. So if you could sit down, please, and find a microphone.
Ja ma tegelikult tahaks teile sellise samasuguse algusvõimaluse anda.
And actually would like to give you this opportunity to introduce the topic, because as you have listened to this discussions and presentations we've had so far, then I'm sure all of you have your own point of view when it comes to this topic, looking at the financing of the research and project-based research and reporting. So perhaps you could all say what are your ideas.
Sellest varasemast päevast meil siin. Kes iganes.
So whoever wants to start.
Mikrofonid töötavad.
Tundub, et olemasolev süsteem on näidanud, mis on
I think the existing system has already indicated what the pros and cons are. I believe the time is ripe now for changes.
Saame tõsta lauale küsimused, mis
And maybe we can also raise some questions which might be intriguing, and we can talk about some ideas and solutions which have been out of focus so far. So maybe it's a sort of a perfect revolutionary situation.
Enda poole pealt muidugi ma pean möönma, et ma olen osaliselt muidugi kurja juur sellepärast.
I'm actually the root of evil, I would say, because as I represent the Minister of Finance, then our Department of Financial Control, I'm sure it's beloved. But if we think about the logic of financing, then the question is, what would be the different alternatives? Because what we're talking about today is that the system is full of bureaucracy, and we know that the bureaucracy goes down in one place, goes up somewhere else. If you look at the financing of research, then this is an example which you cannot really find in other fields, because you have so many different sources, because there is an earmark on any bit of money which says that now you have to keep all these pots separately as well. And then it might get complicated. So the question is what it is, what you do, the expenses. So is the expense, did it go under one or two or three projects, or how do you measure the working hours? Of course, complicated. Or you can see it the other way around, but what you can look at is that in addition to the state budget, we have some other resources, other sources which agree to finance research. There could be some different European projects, for example. So on the other hand, it's nice to have money to do this work. Now, are we willing to handle certain level of bureaucracy in order to gain that value? An alternative question could be that what would be this kind of system which should be easier to handle. So theoretically, can we now move this way that we put all the money into one purse at the university? More or less everybody knows what they're supposed to do, or how much money has been earmarked for their field, and then the university will look at it and make sure that everything gets done without specific earmarking of funds. But now there is no such system, but theoretically maybe we could ask, would this make your life easier, or does it raise any questions? And somebody says, well, I brought in this sort of financing. Now, can I do things with that amount of money? We have talked about these topics quite a bit today, and I'm not sure if we have actually discussed the root problems in principle, as it was as a Minister of Education and Research, Jaak Aaviksoo said that research has to look into the real solution for real problems. So what is a real problem in this discussion? What is the root? We have discussed this a little bit already in our previous presentations. And looking at the trends of the world and other examples as well. So we have multiplicity of projects and financing. Compared to people, there are really so many projects and there are many ways of financing it. Now, if you look at the trends in the world, then I think in the future it's not possible to have only one source of financing. That was in the Soviet Union where this option existed, and this time is probably not coming back. And there will be multiplicity of sources. So the question really is, how are you going to handle the situation? What are the methods which you're going to use for that purpose? So the previous speakers talked about it as well. And Estonia is an e-country, so we are doing everything digitally, so maybe we can find a better outcome than we've been able to find so far. If you look at the international experience, then in Estonia we have done quite a lot of work, and when it comes to reporting, it can be simplified once there is trust. Estonia Research Agency in the grant system has done something which our colleagues in Europe cannot do in the nearest future, because we have minimum of reporting. We have 5-year grant reports. You need to submit 2 instead of 10 for the whole period. We are not asking reports by single expenses, but I want 2 groups, salaries and the rest of the expenses. But that means for the rest of it, for the use of financing, we have to have complete trust. And some examples, we trust our partners, but we have some examples where you need to go a long way in order to gain this trust. I'm not going to give you specific examples, but they are sometimes situations where the certain conditions are not met, and then we need whistleblowers, and then it's not causing trouble for the agency, but you often cause trouble for your colleague who then is working within the rules. So if we want somebody who's a postdoc who would like to gain international experience and would bring it back to Estonia, and then we find that no, actually he has not been abroad because he works in Estonia. And but the institute says no, he's abroad, because that's when it's good to have whistleblowers. And these are the cases when we will react. We have stopped the grant allocations for people who say that they're working for Estonian Research Institute, but other sources say that no, they are working as a full-time professor in a university of some other country. So the trust has to be there, and for building that trust, we need to work for it. In principle, I agree with all the previous speakers, but from the enterprise side of things, I would say that there is a certain contradiction. Because if enterprises want to get the outcome in short term, then scientific projects and scientific teams work on it long term.
nüüd tuleb rahastajatega see kokku leppida ja
And
lahendada
with
see olukord,
finances, we need to
see
come
oleks
to an
vastastikku
agreement.
huvitav, et
We
ettevõtjad
would
saaksid oma
need to have
tulemused ja
a
teadlased
mutually
saaksid
satisfactory
rahulikult ja
situation where
segamatult
they
tööd teha ja
business
jälle
get the interest covers and the
tööd ja saavutada
researchers
sellist
can
tulemust, mida
work
on rahvamajandusel lõpuks
as well
ka
and
vaja.
achieve results which is
Probleemne
good
koht on
for
kindlasti
everybody.
erinevad
But what is the
rahastusallikad,
problem is when we have different finance sources
rööprähklemised, nagu tänapäeval
and you have
tavatsetakse
this
öelda,
multitasking.
et teadlased tihtipeale ei
And
saagi
often
keskenduda oma
researchers
põhitegevuse
cannot
peale,
really
vaid
focus
peavad
on their
tegelema
research because what they need to do
erinevatest allikatest
is they have to
rahade
work with
taotlemisega. Ja
applying
kust
for funds
tekivad veel
from
need
different
erinevad
sources.
probleemid, mida eelkõneleja
So,
rääkis, et kiputakse natuke nagu üle jala laskma või
how we
selliseid
can,
valskasi tegema. Võib juhtuda sellest, et
how the things tend to slide is that the financing sources and measures are different and you need to come
sellest segasest olukorrast
to a common understanding how you get a result where the work is done and everybody gets the results they need.
Andres Koppel alustas juba nagu selle
Andres Koppel already started with a question that I wanted to put to all of you next. So I'll ask now the others as well. During the day, we have been talking a lot about the importance of trust between the different parties in order to be able to develop a more logical system, a smoother system.
Mis meil on Eestis siis ees, et seda usaldust täna nii palju ei ole?
Is it why we do not have such trust in Estonia? What are the obstacles that we have to overcome in order to get more trust? I think there is not such a bad crisis of trust. Nobody really wants anything bad. Everybody wants to achieve a result, but sometimes the means are not chosen properly. But I think we will be able to overcome this if we went in depth into the matters. I've been thinking about the University of Technology. I'm a graduate myself. So when we figured out something, we had to develop a prototype that had to work, because otherwise it's of no use to everyone. But legislation, for example, and rules get developed very often so that nobody tests them or creates a prototype for them. Nobody really tries it out in real life, whether the timesheets really work in real life. So the officials should also look into the mirror and ask themselves if they have contacted the people who have to follow their rules and regulations, and whether they really work in real life. So this is one of the main questions. We should have pilot projects and prototypes for these kinds of things as well, and see if they work or not. So if they work, then we will go ahead and let the ministers and the government and the parliament sign it off. But as long as they have not been tried out in real life, it's going to be very difficult to make them, make people follow them. But what about prototypes? Is it possible to create such prototypes? Well, following on from this subject, I would like to explain some background, why such rules come about, which sometimes make people surprised. In this spring, we had this lovely example. You remember a scientist who had to fulfill the timesheet to the precision of 4 times after the comma. How can you end up in a situation like that? But it was clear that this was not what the requirement was, but he had somehow come to this. Even 2 places after the comma is difficult to believe, really. We are not speaking about things like that. We do not put such obligations to people. So it's again the matter of need and trust. The general logic is, well, you do something, we pay for this. If you work full-time, you get the whole salary and so on. But now it is a situation where people work a little bit in one project, a little bit under another project, and the third place as well. So the question is, how shall we allow this? And at one point, the decision was made about the worksheets. So what is the worksheet? Yeah, it's the same thing. We trust you that you fulfill it accurately, because I can never be able to come and check whether you were honest when you fulfilled your worksheet or timesheet. And again, these very strange examples come up. Well, the latest example, Friday afternoon, I was sitting with the head of a national foundation and the head of the supervisory board, and they have a very interesting project where 2 members of the management board pursue this project, and they spend 75% of their working time on this, and in addition to that, the project takes 40 hours a week from them. Plus, there are also other people in the management board who have to check this work. Well, it is really difficult for me to believe that they are working 11 hours a day every day, and 75% of the total time is spent on that project. But it is not up for me to go and prove that maybe they actually spend 50% of the time. So we talked about this, and I told them, well, look at this realistically. And the same applies to the timesheets. We do trust you. At the end of the day, we trust you. And then all these colorful cases crop up. We had a timesheet where the person was in Brazil at the time and was also working 8 hours a day for the project. So when you were on a business trip to Brazil, how can you explain this? And the answer was, well, listen, the conference was such a bore that the full time I was only working on my project. So go and prove this then. So timesheets are an example of the same kind of trust. And now we'd rather think of proportions. You spend 1/3 in one project, 1/3 in another project, and then the rest of the time you do something else. Let's agree about this, and let's not go into further detail about this. So this is what the view you should have, and we should start asking questions when something is really out of proportion, like someone maintains that was working in Estonia but actually was somewhere else altogether. So what shall we do afterwards? Shall we ask the witnesses, did you see him walking around in the house or in the building? The next thing, what happens in the future? We are not really glad about going and checking the invoices. Yeah, at one point it could be really interesting if you go and see in the Tartu Chemical Institute to see what kind of chemicals they've been buying. And it's really not up for us to decide, or because we do not really have a clue about how they do this or what they need. But you could also think it the other way around. And we've been also speaking towards Europe about this. We should think of goals versus results, output. And every project will have budget expenses that you apply for. And that means that you will have a kind of an idea of the cost proportion. So we could probably use a lump sum payment that you get money in return for results. You provide the results and we will pay for it. And we are not going to check that later that you purchased some coffee machines or where exactly you spent the money. But today the European Commission is not taking this very well. Yes, in some cases you could do this. This idea of simplification is going ahead, especially in the social fund. And next week we are going to have a discussion about this in Tallinn. And this applies also to the European Regional Fund. I think the European Commission is planning a next meeting on this in the month of January, because the universities use the funds mostly from the Regional Development Fund. So maybe more flexibility is being built into the systems. But there's also disadvantages then, because other problems crop up. Yeah, well, give them the money, then you do not produce the results. But then some people think, how could I do this as cheap as possible? So you could also look at these kinds of risks. And in some fields, you cannot use such an option because they do know what they want to achieve, what their general objective is, but what kind of tests and things they need to achieve this is not clear at the beginning, and they just go ahead step by step. So for that kind of project, it's easier to submit invoices in order to figure out what the final cost would be. Well, listening to this, what thoughts came to you? Is this performance or output-based funding something that the universities could be happy with? Or would that be rather a risk and danger? If the universities encouraged KAUR and the Ministry of Finance to change this, that would be really good, because the timesheet is an instrument for the purposes of dividing costs as well. It may not be the best instrument to measure results. The results could be something that are really something that should give you an idea how the R&D activities have been achieved. So I can only praise KAUR for doing such a change. If we were to think about the fact that you describe at the beginning the expected results, pursue your research, but the results turn out to be negative. Yeah, well, we had a hypothesis, but we did not get such a result that we had thought, and the result is negative in this sense. Wouldn't that be a risky business for such way of funding, where you fund the results? I cannot see any problem in this. Somebody already said a negative result very often is a result as well. And definitely, this is not a problem. I would rather think that one of the aspects that would take us closer to the main idea mentioned by Andres is the question about effectiveness. And when we speak about controls, then we should also look at the effectiveness of the whole system, so that the whole side of the control or auditing or validation or whatever instrument is being used, this is also a facet of the efficiency of the system. And universities are different from the rest of the society because we get controlled many times, even if I exaggerate a little bit, but every euro in the budget of the university gets checked 3, 4, or even 5 times. So when we look at the risks in the society in general, are universities such risky businesses that they have to be checked so many times? Maybe not. And maybe this high burden that we have today could be reduced by using a method where the financial audit and evaluation, the two systems that both are based on the best international standards, maybe these two things could be somehow combined. And if the financial audit and evaluation gives an assurance to the university in general and its processes, then you could think that the project monies that are channeled through this organization are actually in good hands. And maybe there is no need to carry out additional controls. The additional control should be left on like sample basis rather than the full-time controls. If the two main processes do not show any additional risks. Let me go back now to this. I was going to ask what Thomas Estermann was speaking about, and what we also heard on the basis of the example from Ireland. So could it be then that we audit internal processes rather than look at the whole process and the whole project and the project reports. Could that be a solution? Should we work towards this in Estonia? The answer is yes and no, depends on different circumstances. One thing that has to be kept in mind is the requirements by the funder, whether the funder agrees. And today, at least, when we look at Europe, then current costs are controlled quite considerably, not fully 100%, but close to that. And we expect our Archimedes society also to control most of it because the rules say that. And when there is an additional audit, that should also give an assurance that everything is correct. And the audit sample should have costs selected on the basis of the costs. So if they are higher costs, then more costs should be audited as well. But when we look at the discussions of simplification, then the question was also whether we could base ourselves on previous years. It would be logical to see where the larger costs went, but at the same time, major major projects are running from year on, year off. So when 1 year everything was okay, can we accept that if everything was accurate the year before that, then we can also trust them to do everything right in the current year. But the Commission did not give us permission or give us an answer when we suggested this. But this is what we are thinking about, that we could use this method. So on the one hand, that would give you an answer about the system. But then the other aspect is that the homogeneity of universities is something that you know better. On the one hand, you have this administrative support system behind it, but then it's also the question what happens in the different faculties or institutes. Maybe I'm wrong, but I get this impression that in different faculties there could be different internal culture of how things get done. And it does not come down only to this, but rather what has happened. For example, issues that have come up have to do with the fact that somebody in the faculty has had some kind of creative ideas about how to use the money or how to channel the money somewhere else. And you do not pick this in the general system. Every faculty could have different subjects. Whether they do the tendering on themselves, then the picture could be quite different. If there is a general tendering process, then it could be more, it could be similar. But then look at the gray area, for example, of researchers who have their own companies, and the universities get purchasing things from those companies owned by the researchers. And they themselves obviously are in a situation where they do not sign off their own purchases from their own companies. But this is a kind of a gray area. And at one point, this may become a dangerous area that should be monitored. So we cannot say that the auditing system could be rearranged so that we could trust everybody just point blank. But as a trend for the future, it could be something that we could really pursue or think about, especially about those entities who get large amounts of support. Take our universities, or take, for example, even our unemployment insurance fund, who year on, year off are applying or implementing really large programs. And they could have some experience in this. I have another question about auditing processes. If this is a reasonable but not a very realistic trend, maybe as an intermediate step, different funders and different funding measures could carry out joint audits so that every euro is not checked 3 times, but that an audit carried out by one party could be relied upon by other parties as well. Could that be done? Because that would reduce the burden from the universities. And we heard the example from Ireland. The control side burden has been reduced by almost a half.
So one of the aspects is that how to trust the Archimedes, and at the same time with the European Commission. When do we get to this situation, or under which conditions we get that? So if we are very happy with the Archimedes Foundation, then we do not go to the university with our audit because Archimedes was happy, and that's fine. But we don't have the system right now, but there's a question about it. And it could be that it will mean some random sampling, perhaps. But when it comes to cultural grants, then Archimedes checks. Auditor then does some sample testing, but there could be the commission, there could be the Court of Auditors who arrives next. So now, if one of the 3 has carried out the audit, let's say the Financial Control Department or the Ministry or the Commission or the Court of Auditors, the others should not redo the work which has been done. But this picture does not include any other financing sources. So with them, we don't have a deal like this, but with some other finances, maybe they would also check some other costs. Well, it's very hard to add anything, because if we talk about trust, so what kind of methods will increase or improve trust, and which would reduce trust? Then reduction will definitely happen if there is any fraud or abuse of the system, because they would then harm the whole system. So if there is anything wrong, then auditors always get excited and decide to do some extra checks. But how we can avoid this sort of situation? Then the biggest beneficiaries are universities. Then we can do a lot about the rules which are being established, and to increase awareness and how to handle things. And one of the possibilities is what we have in Estonia, but it is right now a very general approach. It's Estonian good science approach, and one of the points says that the researchers and the institutions are responsible for managing the resource entrusted to them well. So, but that's fairly general. If we were to ask now people what to do about this principle, then they don't know what to do about it. They don't know what exactly it means. And this is the next level up, which would happen then, that we have internal regulation or arrangements which would cover it. So the universities would need to develop their own scientific or research ethical framework. And our research agency is also working on it, because we are preparing now a document which looks into all these cases, what's going to happen if something happens. So what the process is, we should know. So how to increase this awareness that things would not go wrong, and if things do go wrong, then we should know how this reporting and everything else happens, because otherwise it seems to be that we are the chosen people in the world who are free of sin, basically, if nothing ever were to happen. But, well, people are people. Life has shown that everybody is mortal. And I'm pretty sure the same is true for us. So you need to be prepared for something going wrong, and we need to have a system in place. For example, if there is a fraud or plagiarism, falsification of data in research, then we know that the guilty party is basically crucified. And there is an impression which we have that it will never happen again. But actually, in the system, there are a lot of gray areas. And we need to be prepared to handle these situations. So when it comes to the violation or infringements of financing rules, we need to know what's going to happen next. So I would call upon you, especially when it comes to universities and other research institutions, they should have their own internal regulations in place, And these can be done together to have a common approach. So what you're hinting at is that once your processes are in place and once the agreements are all in place, then that already creates a lot of trust. It creates trust and also it's better for avoidance because when it comes to the ethics, then we know that there is a European association which has developed very clear guidelines or translated them, and they are available on our homepage. And unlike some other ethic documents, instead of saying what the researcher should do, because everybody's pointing fingers always at the researcher, because this document has a new approach which says that the research institutes need to create an environment where researcher can work well and honestly. And creating this environment means also training, awareness raising, and procedures. And I think that's a very important aspect, that these rules are agreed upon. Rules are very important. But it seems to me that we're focusing on things which are a bit marginal, because we say 20%, 80% here. So what gives us most of the revenue, then we sometimes forget about it. And with the excessive bureaucracy, we might be limiting the freedom of the people who are actually creating this value. So we should really think about this, how we can promote the work of the researchers, not taking away the motivation. For example, again, coming back to the timesheets, because this seems to be another tool which should be limiting instead of reviewing the regulations which would make these kind of timesheets futile, because it's not that we're trying to regulate it even more, regulate an existing situation. If I may counter, because we know that the one drop of tar will ruin a pot of honey, as we say in Estonia. So it's a very important topic. And I think there was one of the presentations earlier today. There was a slide which says that the task of the university is to make sure that there are some financial resources available. No, that's a financing point of view. The task of the university is to provide certain services to the society. We need to pay attention to this. Yes, well, we need to pay attention, but they need not to be over-amplified. I would actually express the same idea, because I can really argue for both sides. Because on one hand, we can say that it doesn't matter. We do something with the finances we have, and then we'll see what happens. And the other extreme is that we can say it's the same as law offices. The law office writes down that they write down who is being invoiced for which activities, and they say that this is what we've done during this hour, my phone calls, I did this, I did that, and then you send your bill. So, but I do not want to come to this same principle and saying the timesheet is a nice thing. I would say no, and we would like to get rid of it. So rather we'd make sure that there's a proportion. 1/3 of your working time is part of for this project, and that's for next 2 years, and that's it. So that would make sense. And another thing we should pay attention to is the objective. And here we have again two views. On one hand, the state finances universities in order for them to carry out the functions, and the university knows very well what to do and how. But on the other hand, when it comes to the European funding, the general idea is achievement of change, and you wanted to get something done, and that's why you have projects. So we have a project in order to achieve a certain change. Would it be a specific project, or is it a bigger reform, or something else? So what it means is that when it comes to grants, I would say yes, we provide funding, and it would be quite clear what the outcome should be. But often when I come to the structural funds, then the understanding I have is that lots of money goes into universities. And then the universities would say, well, okay, we'll decide what you're going to do about this now. A little bit of this science, a little bit of that science. So this kind of a clarity of objectives is something which is missing. And once again, it can be reviewed in two ways. One thing, a project-based approach is good because we establish for ourselves what it is we want to achieve, what is the scientific outcome, or we can say that in a certain field you can't do anything because there are some tests or research which ends in nothing. And then we have a certain headache with the research community that you have one project which comes to an end and now you have to deal with starting a next one. And this is one of the dilemmas we can discuss, what it is we don't need to do, because it could be that we hear more about this than anything else. So what are the gaps, potential gaps? Because if one project ends now and the next one starts in a couple of months' time, so what are they going to do in between? So this is what causes a problem when we have a project-based financing. There were some quite intriguing thoughts. Because universities are public legal institutions, that means that we have decentralized approach. When it comes to the Constitution or any other laws, universities have their objectives stated by the statutes and bylaws. And then there's another side of it, which says that when it comes to public law institutions, then they need to be sustainably financed. So similar discussion we have already on the local government level, who are equally public law persons based on the statutes. So now the parliament gives an administrative task to a local government. The parliament has to make sure that there's also funding for that. So the distribution of financing and the tasks is something which need to match up, because you can't say that money doesn't matter because the universities only have the tasks they need to fulfill, because they need to really go hand in hand. Since I'm sitting next to somebody from the Ministry of Finance, I would like to remind a proposal which came from the structural funds, from the project-based approach, because there is a large part of it. We say that we're using the financing from structural funds for the financing of science because the state does not provide adequate financing. So I would... when it comes to this permanent financing from the taxpayers' money instead of project financing, that's I would be agreed with it, because our top-level research institutes are financed from structural funds. That doesn't really happen anywhere else, because I think it's an administrative trick. But it's quite dangerous in a way, because it's not good to work based on projects only. And it doesn't really make sense to work on projects, because from structural funds you can build a building where when it's done, it's done. You can see it, then it's very easy to audit it. Then you cut a ribbon, you open it, and you have a certain size and everything is done. It's got a roof and everything. But if you have a top-level research center, then you can discuss it, whether the outcome of research gave a new discovery or 2 patents. Then you cannot really discuss it, because research is part of the culture and it's the basis of university-level education. So of course it carries out its function. So on these debates, we should see that we need to reduce the multiplicity of sources where possible, and we need to be courageous, and we need to make sure that our own state maintains our university structures. So what I said before, that everybody needs to be actively participating, but I have not offered you a chance to take the floor yet. I'm sure there are some ideas. It doesn't have to be a question, maybe a comment, which you can share with the others. So let's have a microphone, please.
Sissejuhatuseks nii palju, et kui me tahame saada
As a way of introduction, if we want to get pure gold, then 99% of it comes with one price. If we have a 99.9% proof, then it's more expensive. So every 9 we add costs, and the cost grows very fast. So this is a way of introducing the topic. So the understanding that we can get rid of everything, it's not really a final, it's not really a good idea, because we have to make sure that we have some sort of sensible error rate, because then we can measure if these methods are proportional. What we can see in university, and not only, because often what happens is that there is a 10 euros to be picked up and you spend 1,000 to get to it. So checking it, some expenses should not cost more than 10% of what you're going to verify. So there has to be some sort of quantitative assessment. So then it's easier to find a balance. Any other thoughts and ideas?
Küsimusi tekkinud kellelgi? Hetkel on see võimalus. Ei näe praegu. Okei. Siis ma läheks korraks Aavo juurde, et ma saan aru, sa enne natukene mitte seda nagu niimoodi sõnaselgelt välja öeldes,
I think there was something you hinted at earlier.
Sellele, et kui ettevõtted teevad, siis
because if the enterprises cooperate with universities and then there are certain financing rules which will apply, that can be quite demotivating. It's you no longer might be quite enthusiastic about what they want to do. It is very true when, in light of the recent events which we all heard through the media with a whistleblower report, and there were quite a few companies which decided not to cooperate with us anymore. And that was the reason, because we don't know what's going to happen next. Because sometimes it was really baseless accusation, but the outcome of it can be quite serious, especially from the finance point of view. And I agree with what Mr. Aaviksoo said, that the money spent on auditing should not be ridiculously high, because right now a lot of steam goes into processing things, and then it's like no time you have left to actually work, because we discuss it all day. There are some topics which are more or less have a better perspective, but because then who controls the controllers? So maybe I'm exaggerating, but it seems to be like this. So of course, if somebody gives you money, of course, if there's money being given, of course, there has to be enough auditing process or control over it, that we know that we've got what we agreed upon. So if one person carried out one task, then it's we don't need to know who was the specific person who carried out the task. In my activities, I'm oriented on outcome, and this is all I can do, because this is the payment comes through sales. So I'm oriented towards sales, and I'm glad that universities are also getting more concerned about marketing and sales and things like that. So what we discussed so far, our hands are tied right now, because you've said quite a few times that when it comes to the Commission and the other sources or other funders, you have asked them to do things differently, but there is not much flexibility. We discussed it during the lunch break as well, and then I asked about the same topic from Thomas, and he said that the European financing share is not going to remain that high, and there is a point of time when we're going to have a next finance period, and this amount will go down,
katma või üle
and
võtma
our own national financing has to take it over, and then it's a lot easier to handle. So it's not very realistic at the moment, but maybe this is also something we need to bear in mind. And then do you feel that your hands are not so tied anymore and you can use more these kind of models we discussed today? Maybe it's not a too distant future, but it might be. So there was a random idea for period 2021 to 27 is that if with the Commission we come to understanding that the national control system is sufficiently rigorous, then we can move on to the national control model. So we have not quite specified what does it mean and the way we see it, and maybe how does the Commission understand it or the auditors. But there is a certain glimmer of light. Now, when it comes to today's control procedure, then what we spend the money on should then be verified with sample groups, for example, to make sure we know what happened to these expenses. I don't know of any other models, because in Ireland they said that also they are checking who worked where and how much has been paid. So that's the negative side of things. But at the same time, from the grants point of view, it's a good balance. And to know what our approach is, because on one hand, a grant is being given, which you otherwise would not get. On the other hand, you need to subordinate yourself to the verification process. So somebody will ask you, well, how did you spend this money? So it makes sense, because if the administrative burden which comes with it is too high, then you might also say that, okay, maybe this is not the project I need to participate in, and this is not the money I want to get. So that's the other side of things. But it doesn't mean that we would not be able to optimize things. But over the years, these principles have increased. So if you have somebody who is creative and then messes things up somehow, then you say, okay, there might be others, let's have a new rule. And there are more and more rules. And then there are so many extra things, and then you say, okay, maybe we should look at the outcome, not look at the details, because nobody has any energy to deal with the details. But then if there is no outcome, then what? You have to pay the money back. So regardless how you're going to review it, it contains its own risks. So when it comes to the future, then we might have a possible opening that we might start with a national model. And in the Commission drafts, it says that you might continue with the national control model. Most of the models are based on structural grants, but this can be also interpreted as in that we can have a different model for ourselves, which will be optimal for our purposes. So this is how I would see it until anybody proves the opposite. So there is hope, but it doesn't remove the control from this process. If you look at the volume of it, then it's again, look at the total grants, then we are within a couple of percentages. And the whole administration today is on 2%, which is on the state side. And what happens next is that the question is what is the cost for the university? Because you have several hundred millions in, but in order to manage it all, you need accountants and all that. That's your own cost. But then from the state's point of view, you have total cost of a couple of percent and audit cost as well. So we have audits, and we cover about 60 million euros, and it's an expense of 20 people, and the proportion, I would say, is fairly suitable. And what we need to think about is that if our implementing agencies are looking at all the invoices, then the admin expenses are within a couple of percentages looking at the whole financing aspect of it. But that's part of it, but the cost of administration in the country is around 2%. I would like to stress that administrative cost at the beneficiaries is a separate expense. So probably last moment to participate in the panel discussion.
Sekkuda küsimuse või mõtteavaldusega, siis ma annan siin niimoodi panelistidele sellise lõpuküsimuse, millega...
Or then I'll have a final question for the members of the panel.
Kas on hetkel veel ruumis, kellel...
Or is there anything to add from the audience? Any comments, any questions?
Kas me saame mikrofoni?
Maybe I just would like to add something which has been discussed.
Mul on midagi lisada, mida me oleme arutanud, ehk siis küsimus on selles, kus need keerulisemad kohad on Euroopa tasandil ja võib-olla seda on juba ka päris hästi selgitatud. Nii et teoorias meil on tõepoolest võimalus, kuna finantsmäärustik on muutunud, vaadates ka nüüd Horisont Euroopa programme, et me aktsepteerime ka rohkem siseriiklikke praktikaid ja see on üks eeltingimustest, mida on vaja selleks, et auditit läbi viia. Kuid mis on olnud probleemiks, on küsimus on seotud kõrgemal tasemel poliitilise kokkuleppega. Me võime öelda, et jah, me peame seda tegema, aga kui me jõuame rakenduseni, siis meil tekivad tõkked. Ning kui teil on võimalik panustada sellesse arutelusse, siis me peaksime kindlasti omapoolse panustama, et teooria läheks üle praktikaks. Näiteks, kui me räägime toetuste mudellepingust Horisont Euroopast ja on ka siseriiklikke eksperte, kes on kaasatud. Meil on arutelusid ka nõukogu tasandil. Nii et meil on siseriiklikke eksperte ja poliitika kujundajaid. Ja mida rohkem me sellesse kaasa räägime, seda tõenäoliselt on see, et me rakenduses saame liikuda paramise poole.
Kohe selle peale kommentaar
Do you have any comments? And my question perhaps is that even if there is a potential for moving on to use of national system, which doesn't exist today, and we haven't even discussed what it could be like yet. So perhaps should we really try to figure it out together? Or should we think about it more on the European level and contribute more towards our understanding of it?
I recommend the simplification on the European level. Yes, this issue should be pursued, but quite cautiously, because there are certain events in Europe as well where monies have been misappropriated and misused. But a reasonable system, a simple and rational system, if we can emphasize this or speak about this wherever, in whatever fora, especially when you happen to meet someone from the European Commission, they are usually not ready to accept these ideas, but it's worth a try anyway. About the others. Well, I do not have anything to say about this, but maybe another idea, quite a revolutionary idea maybe, heading off from where the root cause is. There are too many schemes. It is too much for everyone. And it could happen so that you break the rules somewhere. The rules are to be followed, that's for sure. You cannot say that we have too many projects and we don't really know what's written in the contracts. Maybe you should consider it that should we participate everywhere, in everything? Maybe we should avoid riskier businesses, so to say, and not pursue money and then find ourselves trapped. Maybe this is not a popular idea, but then someone might ask, where do we get the salaries for our researchers then? But every idea ought to be considered. But where do they get their salaries then? We saw that 80% of the funds come from the project-based funding. Then, it's quite a complicated situation. Yeah, probably it's difficult to give up the structural funds because of the sheer amount of money that comes from there. It should be a political agreement on the political level that science funding will be done by the state. This is really important. That would be a solution, but it wouldn't work right now. But like Ülle Jäätma said, we have 20 different funding schemes. So risk assessment should be done also within the universities. So where is the chance where you could find yourself trapped and what could be given up? It's easier for me to say because I do not work in the university. Let me just add something to this. Money does not come from anywhere else but from selling. And the state gets its money from exports. That's the main thing. And exports depend on innovation. The main thing is we should not restrict innovative activities by adding bureaucracy and technical work. I would like to touch upon a theme that I would really not like to discuss. But one thing that I'm scared of most is innovation for certain reasons. We do need this a lot. This is a field from where we have the worst cases of fraud. I have no idea why. But because these companies who have caused this, done this, they've been doing a lot of very innovative things and nobody really understands what they do. Let's order it from a Finnish university, who orders it from a Russian university, and the money ends up in Luxembourg, and they are developing a mobile SIM card or whatnot. So, and somebody was organizing or creating an innovative windmill. Well, let's do it. But eventually, not a single producer in America or in Europe has agreed to buy this. So eventually they enter into agreement with an Indian mental company, try to fix it for us and make it for us. So it is clear that the state has to support innovation, but it also has to be aware of what is really being done, because real life have shown that they have just tried to rob us of the money without really pursuing any development or research or even wanting to do this. Let me oppose to this idea, to add more to this intrigue. Yes, you have examples like that, that's for sure. But these examples should not be a restriction on real work. If we only focus on the negative examples that you just pointed out, these subjects will take on a life of their own, and then we cannot engage in things that really produce wealth for us. Well, let's focus on honest, active people, not just crooks and frauds.
Jah, see on üks põhimõttelisi probleeme. Alustatud teema juures tagasi, et mis see juurprobleem on.
Mentioned by Andres, what is the root cause, the root problem? The World Economic Forum came up with the competitiveness report for 2019, and Estonia was ranked 31st, having improved its position by one place. And this report is based on 4 pillars: macroeconomic balance, human capital, size of market, and innovation. Innovation, the favorite of Kalle. So when we look at the first pillar, macroeconomic balance, when it came to Estonia ranked at 100% there, or close to 100%. Human resources, the result was more than 80%. size of market. Obviously, for obvious reasons, when we have 1.3 million people living in Estonia, this market is one of the smallest among the 140 countries involved, and we are only slightly in a better position when it comes to innovation. So there is really a weakness that we have, and not on the level of each and every company, but rather on the state level in general. So there might be a systemic problem, and we need make joint efforts in order to improve this, also when it comes to funding. And I have a final question to everyone, and please look at the eye of each other here in the panel. Our universities depend a lot today on project-based funding. A lot of the research is funded by projects in the budgets, but then the burden on the university and the researcher when it comes to reporting is quite high. It could even become an obstacle to doing the principal activities. And again, at one point we have trust, and another point we may not have too much of trust. But when I look at your fellow panelists here, how could we take it from here so that the money that we have can be used as effectively as possible in order to produce good results, scientific results that at one point will be turned into innovation and products that can be exported? So what are the expectations for each and every one of you from others? And on the other hand, what could you do when you leave from here? So you could voice your expectations concerning the other parts of the whole system. Well, the main question is bureaucracy. Not as such. Well, bureaucracy has to exist, but all these forms that have been developed, that have to be fulfilled, we should have prototypes for them beforehand and see that they really work, so that they are not just created for the sake of creating them. That would reduce administrative burden, both on the one hand, both for those who have to make the applications for funding, and also for those who have to control them. The panelists will first speak, and then the rector will have the floor as well. Expectations. First and foremost, my expectation is on how to make the universities and companies cooperate. It depends on actually where. Well, we do not expect Estonian scientists in Estonian scientists dealing with, for example, the Estonian language. They might not cooperate with the companies so much, but let's take the real sciences and companies. They could cooperate very well. And when in the future the project monies are going to be smaller, then the question is how to make the companies themselves interested in cooperating with the universities and vice versa, so that the researchers could develop patents that could be afterwards sold to American corporations and raise some money. So this is something that is important. And this is something that has been emphasized on the political level as well all the time. Cooperation between universities and companies is very important. All the rest is just to support this idea. We just give you the money in order for you to engage in such cooperation. That is why I would like also to ask another question. How does this feel in practice? Because the idea of giving the support, the financial support, for example, in your food technology field, so that the cooperation between the universities and your companies could work so that at one point you wouldn't need support at all from the state. And you will be able to pursue your activities on your own without having to have extra support for this. So this is what I would like to happen. So I have glad to tell you that our cooperation with the Tallinna University of Technology and some major corporations in the world as well has been operating for quite some time already. It's going to work in the future as well. That is why I said before that we should not blame those very successful scientists and companies who have been very successful in such cooperation. Obviously, every fly in the ointment could ruin all this. But if we are clever, we could separate the fly from the ointment. So what are the expectations for the research agency? Let's try to keep the administrative burden under control. Let's look at the indicators that today are quite formal, and let's replace them with real indicators. Let's organize a system where data have to be submitted only once. That means that the private and public sector has to cooperate when it comes to their information systems. And public money should be properly used as well, because neither side will be able to achieve this by themselves. And finally, both innovation and higher education and research needs more money. Well, it's really difficult to add much. We've really discussed many different subjects today, and now we have come back to the main thing, really. That was a very good summary. So when we next meet and discuss the same subject, then let's try to focus on a more specific issue and try to reach some practical solutions as well, because I think we were speaking about too many things at one time today, yeah? But I think the question of trust that has been mentioned several times today, trust has to be built and kept and maintained and nurtured so as not to damage it. This is very important. Important also for the society that is funding our research and higher education system. The society has to be able to believe that the money is being well used. And I am fully convinced that we need more funds to this system, because one of the reasons is that the funding is not enough for Estonia. That is why we are not able to achieve all those goals that we have set ourselves. And once again, I always repeat this as well, that the main product when it comes to research and development is not direct economic growth, but teaching wise, smart people in order to manage in this and in order to cope in this complicated world. People forget this. Sometimes they ask, why do you use microscopes? We should have a plow instead. Let's turn the microscopes into plows again. This was the 1980s and the Soviet Union when they attempted this, and you know what, we all know how this ended. I wanted to make a summary when you said that science and research needs more money, which is true, everybody agrees with that, but we were discussing the risks and how to manage the risks related to funding science. And I would like to ask a fact-based or subjective impression-based evaluation from you. Given the funding cases that we've had now, there has been an opinion that in science or higher education, in more general terms, the risks seem to be very high and the system is not transparent at all. And on the other hand, a well-known colleague and an academician said that we are coming from a situation, a society where cheating was a matter of honor, and that is why we do things that may not be quite right. Do we have reason to believe that science and research is somehow specially risky, whether it is looked upon by the European Commission or structural funds, or whether the money comes from the state budget? So do we have reason to believe that the supervision that has been carried out makes Estonia or the Eastern and Central European countries very corrupt countries or regions? I would rather say that universities have been less risky to expect that something bad would happen or greatly bad will happen. Yes, there is a corruption risk. Could be that somebody starts purchasing things from companies related to the same person, and similar economic kind of crime. But the fact that universities might engage in this, building this wind generator without nothing behind it. Yes, well, the timesheets and things and division of costs, yes, there's administrative errors that come up, but no more than everywhere else. The latest statistics by Archimedes Foundation shows it, how many of the payment requests they have sent back from the universities. So, in summary, it is not a picture that should cause concern. The same principle applies. The university is a cross-section of the whole society, and you may have different characters ending up in your cross-section. Now, when we speak about the timesheets, well, this is not such a big concern unless there is a systemic problem there. So, if something happens in Estonia, it does not show that there could be really big problems with Estonia. Some countries have had to give back billions. For example, the Czech Republic a few years ago. Well, both the Czech Republic and sometimes also Hungary and Bulgaria, their systems have more weaknesses. People who audit them across Europe know that. Estonia does not stand out like that. Even if one or the other thing has happened, the general picture is still not changed. When we look at the statistics of Olaf, then every year, on the average, every year they will find about €1 billion worth of misuse of structural funds monies. Maybe 10 to 20% are related to fraud. The rest are just administrative errors. So if something happens in Estonia, we do not think this is not something that causes a problem on the European level. But when I think of the cases that have happened in Estonia, and when I look at my own position, then it is always to admit the blame and say that it happened. It's not allowed. If something like this really happened, we will find out. We do not tolerate this in our university. And 2 days later, nothing can be found about this in the press. But if you have, if you express doubts, then there's all sorts of bad coverage in the press as well. And this experience shows that if you take matters robustly at hand, and if you admit blame, even if you're quite sure what they actually did, because no one of us knows for sure what happened in one of the other particular case when it all comes out to the press. And even admitting that without knowing what actually happened, you just say, we do not allow this, and the case is closed, and nothing like this is written about this in the newspapers. So this is what I felt. Because at the end of the day, different people come to me and ask, so what is happening at this university? Well, then somebody said, well, this was the Horizon program. And then somebody asks, what about the structural funds? Well, then the Archimedes Foundation will check all their projects. Oh, and in the end, this is something to be considered by all universities. I've been given examples from other universities as well. There have been agreements that, like, for example, one project comes to an end and it takes some time before a new project starts. There's 2 people that need to be covered during this 2 months. So for working time purposes, it's not eligible. I do not know exactly who these scientists were and how this actually worked, but these things come up. But we should admit we do not tolerate this, and that means that this internal problem inside Estonia is smaller. We have started tackling now already individual cases, but I was rather more interested in funding rules and the future of it. So I could hear several potential ideas during this discussion. We have come to an end of this discussion, and I'm sure the discussions continue also on more specific subjects in the future. Aavo Sõrmus, Andres Koppel, Kaur Sirul ja Kurme Tojamaa, thank you all for your contributions.
Aitäh. 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 Nii, ja me oleme jõudnud oma seminariga lõpusirgele, väga lõpulähedale.
Final stretch of our seminar. What is left is to sum up today. I'm not going to do that. I have the pleasure to invite Chairman of Universities Estonia and Rector of Estonian University of Life Sciences, Mait Klaassen, the floor for summing up today's seminar.
Aitäh.
Thank you.
Ma päris ausalt öeldes ei tea, mida
Quite honestly,
tänase päeva kohta
I do not know what you put down in your timesheets for today.
Aga võib-olla see polegi tähtis.
And maybe this is not so important.
Aga lubage mul esmalt
But let me first
rikkuda eesti keele seadust.
To violate the Estonian language law and approach you in English.
Thank very much, Toomas Estermann.
Tahaksin tänada Toomas Estermanni ja Joan Heinsi siia tulemise eest, kutse vastuvõtmise eest ja oma kogemuste jagamise eest meiega. Euroopa ülikoolid, Euroopa riikide poolt ja siis väga praktilist nõuannet kuulsime konkreetselt Iirimaa kohta ning pean ütlema, et ma olen Corki ülikoolis 2 korda käinud, korraga Dublinis, Trinity College'is Dublinis ja need kogemused olid mul tõesti väga head. Ning saime täna tõesti häid nõuandeid teie ettekannetest ning ma loodan, et me töötame koos ka tulevikus, sest meie oleme nüüd välja töötamas omi uusi süsteeme ja loodame võtta üle ka mõned teie seisukohtadest. Suur tänu, et tulite ja töötame üheskoos. Now I will continue in Estonian. I do hope that No one expects me to give you a classic speech of praise or blame, but I will just say what I really think about things. I think the audience here is really composed of very good people who have never thought of abusing anything. But as a veterinarian, I can say, although we were speaking about working time a lot today, then I think that for something else is important for the scientist. Peace is important for a scientist. A scientist needs oxygen. And what is the oxygen for a scientist? It is this permanent funding. When, as a veterinarian, I say, if you reduce or take away oxygen from an animal, then it starts struggling, and you will never get a good product. The same applies to scientists. If we cannot make sure that our scientists have permanent funding that ensures peaceful work for the scientists, then we will not be able to get good results from them. Well, having listened to all the presentations today, this would mean that our primary goal, especially here in Estonia, would have to be to gather all our potential and discuss what kind of reporting form should be followed by everybody by their projects, that we do not have different silos for different ministries or different reporting forms. So when a scientist has a project, then he knows this is the road to be followed, this is written into my quality assurance book or manual, and this is on the basis of which I can be controlled. We'd get rid of many problems then. Yes, it is difficult to offer a similar system to different EU member states because the systems and rules differ. But it is high time in Estonia for us to start thinking that if we want to produce a result, then we should have the simple 10 commandments for the scientists. About working time and measuring working time. Can someone tell me how much time was spent on the theory of relativity for Albert Einstein to write it down? It was only half a page. It's impossible to measure. Equally impossible is to measure when a scientist wakes up at night and figures out the solution, or when a linguist finds a solution. You needn't be a mathematician all the time. You cannot put this into your work timesheet. Why not reorganize the measurement system by using another 10 commandments on how we can measure the result? Let's start using results-based measurement indicators. The result need not be positive, because when a project is being written, then the scope and the volume of work is being calculated. Thomas and Joan spoke about this very well. So it would work really easy. We shouldn't have this awful lot of controls, and we shouldn't be discussing how long it took Newton to sit underneath the apple tree until the apple finally fell on his head. So I would like to thank all the scientists, the administrators. I would like to thank Taltech, Rector Aaviksoo, for having the Universities of Estonia and the Universities Association to organize this seminar. And I hope we can take it from here and we can go continue so that the society really would understand what the scientists are doing, why they are doing this, and that the society realizes that the whole society gains from funding research and science, because this money is being used to produce something useful for the society. And we hope that the society will also be able to build trust with respect to the scientists and universities. Honestly, there are not too many scientists, not too many lecturers. The whole society does not know much about universities, but when we communicate this properly, then I'm sure everybody agrees to increase the funding for science. Thank you for coming, and we wish you a very successful science and research work. Let's wait for this apple to fall and do not measure everything in time only. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Have a safe journey home. And if you want to listen on watch these presentations once again, then you can see this on our website. Thank you and have a good evening.